Okay, welcome to a class on verbs. It's actually a really tricky question. What is a verb? And I'm going to try and simplify that question by giving you a straight answer. It's a word that has a doer. It's a word that has a subject. They often call subjects doers. They often call doers subjects in grammar. So when a verb has a doer, it's got a subject. Yeah, we call that doer the subject. And on this course, that's how I want you to understand a verb, okay? But verbs are actually used in a lot of different ways. They don't only function as verbs. Sometimes they function as adjectives, and we call them participles. Sometimes they function as nouns, and we call them gerunds. Sometimes they function adverbially, yeah, and we'll look at that later. Some participles are adverbial. So verbs are very tricky. They can function in a number of different ways. But if we're going to take a classic verb, I want you to think of a classic finite verb as a verb. It's a word that has a doer. It's a word that has a subject, okay? It's got a doer, and so that means that the verb is very often seen in different tenses. So if we take a verb like play, a very common verb, and I remember when I was a student at school, this was usually the first verb we learned in a foreign language. We'd study the verb to play for some reason, and it's a good verb to choose in English because it's nice and regular. But have a look at all of these different forms, and if you're a native, I know that you'll recognise all of those different forms. You would have seen those different forms, yeah, in different books, yeah. Will have seen, will have played. You would have seen these different forms in different books, and so this is what I mean by the verb will appear in a tense. It might appear in past tense, it might appear in present tense, it might appear in future tense. But when the verb has a doer, it appears in a tense, and I think that's very important. And as a teacher of English as a foreign language, you have to spend a long time explaining to students when you say I am playing, when you say I have played, when you say I had been playing, when you say I will have played. Yeah, you have to talk about when all of these tenses are necessary. But I want you to remember that when you have a finite verb, in other words, a classic verb, a full verb, you might call it. I consider it a verb in the fullest sense of the word verb because it's got a doer. It will always appear in one of these tenses when you've got a verb, okay? It will always appear in some kind of tense. And I have tried to show here that there's not just active tenses, there are also passive tenses. Okay, now what do I mean? I'll go into this in more detail because I know some people haven't studied active and passive before. But I just wanted to start with what is a finite verb. Okay, now we're going to look in future classes at non-finite verbs, which are gerunds, participles, 2+ infinitives. These other verbs don't have a subject, they don't have a doer. So in that sense, they are not functioning as a verb because the function of a verb is it has a doer, it has a subject, and it means that it must be in some kind of tense, okay? So that's what I want you to understand as a verb. And we do a lot of definitions on this course because definitions are so important for understanding what you're dealing with. And we're going to define a verb as a word that has a doer. That's certainly what we're going to define a finite verb as. Okay, non-finite verbs don't have doers and they function in other ways, okay? But we'll look at that in a future class. But finite verbs always have a subject, they always have some kind of tense as well. Now, like all grammar, there's always an exception. And the exception is imperatives. If you have a sentence like this, wait here, yeah, or don't look down. What you might notice here is that both of these sentences have verbs, wait and look. Both of them have verbs, but neither of them have a subject. Neither of them have a doer. And this is because they are imperatives. Orders, you might understand it better as orders. When you say wait, stop, sit down, yeah, don't stare at me or something like that,